We all hung our heads as we made our way back to the locker room my sophomore year of varsity football. I believe at that point the score was 42-7. I remember that they had breached 40, and I remember that we were still in or had just surpassed the single digits. This was a team, Shell Lake. Everybody knew we didn't stand a chance against them. The Prairie Farm Panthers were too tiny. Yeah, I went to school called Prairie Farm. It was awesome. We were too tiny of a school, they said. We didn't stand a chance, and we were certainly proving it. As we walked back inside at the half, every one of us dreaded going back out. It didn't feel like there was any point in continuing because at this point it was just embarrassing. We were humiliated. We were defeated 42-7 at the half. As we got back in the locker room and we sat there in silence taking a knee, Coach Big walked to the center of the room. And as he opened his mouth to speak, he paused and he clenched his fists as his body tensed up. And then with nowhere else to put his energy, he just kicked the air around him. Gosh, I need a haircut, don't I? Just watching the hair bounce in front of my face. I gotta get that covered soon. Claire's gonna be so pumped. She's like, oh, praise God. When Coach Big opened his mouth, what followed was the pep talk of the century. This was the thing that war movies, that sports movies are made of. He began, "Where is your heart, Panthers?" he asked, referencing our team name. "This game is so far from over, but you've been playing like it's done since the first quarter. You're capable of more. We have more in us. Play like you have more in you." And then for the next 10 minutes, rather than tell us what we needed to do better, he told us what we already could do, what we were already capable of. Honestly, I don't remember every detail of that speech. But I'll never forget the look of Coach Big silhouetted by the lights of the open door, or the way that we felt as he gave his final challenge. "Show me your heart," he said, as we rose back to our feet and walked out of the locker room doors. I'll never forget the way we lifted our heads as we stepped back out on the field, or the way that we felt as we eventually won the game 48-42. Well, yeah, the gasp, right? In my life, there is one moment that felt like an actual movie, and it was that one. It was almost unbelievable. I remember almost nothing of that second half other than a Hail Mary pass on fourth down that went into the end zone for a touchdown. I don't remember much, but I remember the speech that Coach Big gave to us more than anything. The way that he gave us words of wisdom, words of encouragement, words of challenge, the words that gave us belief in ourselves and in him as our coach. It was his words that proved to be the MVP that night, because when we walked into that locker room, we were already defeated, but by the time we walked back out, we may as well have already won. We were a different team. Have you ever had a really good pep talk? That's mine. That's the one I know. That's the one I remember. Where we're about to pick up in the story of Israel, this is exactly where we find the people of God in the midst of a great pep talk. For years and years, it feels like they have been on the losing team. For an entire generation, from almost the moment they set foot out of Egypt, it's felt to them that they're losing. In frustration, they've wandered the desert, hoping for more water and better food. They have caught a glimpse of the promised land, and while it was beautiful, they found there were a lot of very strong-looking people there, and this is a nation of wanderers, not warriors. The promised land looks a whole lot less promising. Over and over again, they've tried to turn back to Egypt because as hard as it was there, at least they weren't constantly terrified for their lives. For an entire generation, Israel has been in a space where it feels like they're down at the half. But now, things are about to change. Through their challenges, God has prepared them. And in just a few short days, God will lead Joshua and the nation of Israel into the promised land to claim his victory. And right now, after all of it, with one final charge, with one final pep talk, God prepares Joshua and prepares Israel to enter into something better than they could have ever imagined, where their constant difficulty leads to one of his greatest victories. And I think that God's pep talk for Joshua and for Israel is a beautiful encouragement for us. I really believe that our church has done and is on the cusp of some very wonderful things. We've been through trials. Practically every church in America has been deeply challenged over the last several years between the pandemic and the culture war and the seemingly endless divide. But even though the world isn't what it once was, I think God has been preparing us and is leading us into a beautiful what could be. Over the course of the last several years, I've watched and praised God as I've seen us grow in unity in the midst of a time where so many people are so divided. I've watched and I've praised God as our congregation, who's always been very good at care, has grown in care. Some of the highlights of my time in all of my life and ministry has been on the weekends when we've taken special offerings and seeing the way that our congregation shows up when the people in our community are in need. I've watched and I've praised God as we've grown in our physical footprint, putting up the new Family Life Center. Here's a fun fact. You may not have known this. Did you know that one of the greatest barriers to church growth is space? You can bring everybody that you want to Jesus and everybody that you want to church, but if there isn't space for everybody, people don't stick around. But because of the work of our God and the hands of our members, we don't have to worry about that barrier. And in the last year, I've watched as we've grown in number. When I first got here, our average attendance was about 115. At the end of May, we were doing about 165 people in here. And it's not all about numbers, but those are lives. Those are people, and they matter. You guys have been doing the work of God in the midst of a difficult time. And as we continue in this vision of cultivating the kingdom, I really believe that God has us on the edge of a threshold, on a cusp that is the harvest. Amen, brother. Whew. Can I get more than that? Can I get an amen? Okay. I love you all. Let's just a little bit better. I want the Coach Big tense body. Hallelujah. One more time. I'll count you down. 3, 2, 1. Amen. Whoo. Yeah. Again, that hair. We got to work on that. So anybody got any bobby pins? This is driving me buck wild. As we continue in this Each One Reach One campaign, if we achieve the goal that we have here, we're going to cross one more major barrier. This is another fun fact. There is a barrier in church growth. They call it the biggest one that exists. They call it the 200 barrier. Churches, when they reach 200 people, usually get stuck, stall out, and move backwards just because of all of the different dynamics that go into that. Once you reach about 200 people, it requires a different mentality, a different attitude, an all-hands-on-deck kind of thing, and a lot of churches aren't up to the challenge. We are. I've seen you guys do the kinds of things that surpass 200 barriers, and this is a church that has surpassed 200 before. I think we're on the cusp of something beautiful where people in our community come to know Jesus like wildfire. And I think that's because of you guys. And so let God's encouragement and pep talk to Israel be an encouragement to us as we dive into Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 through 6. Again, it's Joshua 1, 1 through 6. A few weeks ago, we began our series, Between the Waters, where we've been continuing the journey of Israel, who left Egypt through the parted waters of the Red Sea and who will, 3 days after this passage, enter into the Promised Land through the parted Jordan River. 2 weeks ago, we read the story of the 12 Israelite spies who scouted out the Promised Land and how they, in their fear, discouraged the people of God from entering. And from that story, we learned that part of seeking God's promise is speaking God's promise, to give one another the courage to overcome our fear. Last week, we looked at the story of Moses bringing water from the rock, how he disobeyed God by showing rage instead of the grace that God was trying to represent. And from that story, we were given a reminder that we are Christ's ambassadors. We are his representatives, and that the way that we live and speak in the world around us tells everybody something about Jesus. And this week, where we pick up, Joshua has been commissioned as the new leader of Israel, and Israel is 3 days away from the Promised Land. And in these final days before they step into the promise, Joshua and in turn Israel are given a God-sized pep talk to empower them to enter into a God-sized promise. We read the story in Joshua 1, 1 through 6, which says, "After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord The Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people, get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I am about to give to them, to the Israelites. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon and from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. Here's a little fun fact. The land that he's describing right now, if you've ever been to Israel, it is the best of every world. You get all climates, all seasons, all temperatures. When we talk about a promised land, there is no better teeny tiny plot of land than is that nation to do literally anything a person could want. We'll move on. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them. This passage serves as an introduction to, and in many ways, a summary of the book of Joshua and Israel's story as they continue into the promised land. What God is telling Joshua in this passage is exactly everything that unfolds in the book of Joshua. And in this little pep talk, there's a word that's repeated where if you don't know Hebrew, you're probably going to miss it, because even though it's the same word in Hebrew that's repeated, in this particular passage, it's translated as different words in English. But the repeated word defines the scope and invitation of God's promise to his people. As always, when we look for the meaning of a passage, we look for words that are repeated, because the words we find repeated repeatedly are usually the theme. And the repeated word that we find here is what is translated more often than not in this passage as all. Such a simple word, all, A-L-L. And the way that they used all in their language is actually very different than we do. So in our day and age, in the English language, just about any time we use the word all, it's an exaggeration to some degree. Like, if I look at Claire and I say, hey, baby, I've been thinking about you all day. Was I literally thinking about her all day? At no point did I think about work or food or lunch. I have a couple of people just staring longingly into their partner's eyes. I'm like, hey, I'm right here. I think about work. I think about food. I might have thought about you a lot of the day because I do love you, but all the day, probably not. Or have you ever heard anybody say, it happens all the time? You ever heard that? I can't think of anything that happens all the time. I don't even breathe all the time. Sometimes I pause and think, oh, okay, we're good now. We're good. If we mean all the time, it's every second of every day. No, nothing happens all the time. When we use the word all, when we use words like every, never, it's an exaggeration. Almost every time. Yeah, I didn't mean that one, but it happened. Usually for us to say all is for us to exaggerate. But that's not the case for them in this passage, or for the Hebrew word that it's translated from. So the word all in this passage is translated from the Hebrew word kol, just like the name, kol. And kol, when it's used as scripture, would usually be defined as all, everything, in its totality. When they use the word all, they mean it. Essentially, if they're saying all the time, they mean it happens all the time, every second of every day. I've been thinking about you all day, baby. All day, didn't think about food. Like, I did nothing because I was thinking about you all the time. Every time we see the word all in this passage, it is an all-encompassing kind of thing. Within this passage, even though we only see the word all twice, we see the Hebrew word kol 3 times. And each instance of the word kol gives us an invitation and a lesson on how we step into God's promises for us. So, first time we see it is in verse 2. If we could pull that up, it read, now then, you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I'm about to give them. All these people. With the use of the Hebrew word kol, when we say all these people, that's not a generic phrase meaning a mass conglomeration of people or meaning most of the people. When God says all these people, he means all of Israel, every single one, every single individual. And from that challenge, God gives them the invitation that as they enter into the promised land, they are to go together. And for us, God's invitation as we pursue our promises is to go together. For us, when we go, God is calling us to go in unity. The best way I know to illustrate, the church is a big ship. And the only way a big ship moves forward if you ain't got sails is with all hands on deck. God is our captain, and God is calling us to go together and row together in unity. Watch that. You see that? Like, I'm not doing a sideways lily dipping thing. Ooh, that's a full power row right there. God is inviting us to pursue his promise together, each of us doing our part, going in the same direction. Because all of us just being on the same boat doesn't necessarily mean that we're on the same page. You know what I'm saying there? Have any of you ever been on a canoe where the people aren't paddling together? I was a youth pastor. We would do canoeing trips every now and then. And I'll tell you what, as the person in back, as the adult, it was a zigzag pattern the entire time. We canoe an actual mile, and we probably got 2 miles of work in because that kid in front ain't doing their part. Have you ever been on a canoe where people are rowing against each other? That's even less fun. When you're rowing against each other, at best, you're going to slowly go in the direction you're supposed to be going. At like probably the average, you're going to go nowhere because you're both rowing against each other. And at its worst, if you're rowing against each other, you start moving backwards. And eventually you tip over, and that is a miserable experience for everybody. For Israel, these are the people of God. But in the book of Joshua, when some start paddling in the other direction, it throws the entire nation off. One of the greatest stumbling blocks in all of the book of Joshua, a story of a man called Achan. One person manages to throw the entire nation off of course. But when the people paddle together, they get going further, farther, faster than they ever would have gotten on their own. As a community, we won't step into God's first best if we aren't rowing and going together. It's okay for us to have disagreements, but the more energy we spend going against each other, the less energy we have going forward. Thankfully, as a church, I think we're pretty good at rowing together. Again, I think we're on the cusp of something beautiful. But the way that God invites us to go is to not go on our own, to not all go in whatever direction, but for all of us to go together. It's the first lesson we learned from the Hebrew word kol. The second time we see it in this passage, we're describing all the land. This one's a bit harder to see because the word is translated differently, but as we dive into verse 3 here, you'll see the word every is a translation of the word kol, and we're speaking of all of the land. Verse 3, I will give you all places where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Every single place where you set your foot, every grain of sand and molecule of dirt, because it's an all-encompassing all, will be yours as I promised. And from the use of all in description of the land, God gives us the invitation to go forward. Because he says, as I promised, every place you set your foot. The promised land exists, it's right there, and the way that Israel claims it is by going forward and stepping into it, regardless of any fear. His promise is there, and the only thing limiting it, the only limits of his goodness and mercy are the limits we place on it. How far are we willing to walk into it? This is a silly illustration, but I couldn't think of anything better. It reminds me of Olive Garden. Track with me here. Anybody ever been to Olive Garden? Oh man, I love me some Olive Garden. At this current season of life in our budgeting, we're more $5 biggie bag at Wendy's kind of people. Oh, but when we splurge and we go to Olive Garden, whew, you know who my favorite person is at the Olive Garden? The cheese guy. You guys know the one I'm talking about? So at Olive Garden, they got this dude. He stands back in a corner. He's got a cheese grater. It looks like a fishing reel. It literally has a little wind-up thing on it. Whatever meal you order, you want a salad, you want pasta, you want soup. Once you get your meal, guy comes over with his little fishing reel cheese grater. He stands over your meal and says, tell me when. Starts reeling in the bass and dropping cheese. And what cheese you get is determined how far you're willing to go. Recently, there was a social media challenge to test the limits of this. I've brought a video, if we could pull it up.
Go to Olive Garden and don't say stop for the grated cheese.
Is that good?
This is perfect. You have a little more? Is that it?
There's no more in here, but I can grab you more.
I appreciate you. Oh my, perfect.
In all of the videos that I found of this social media challenge, believe it or not, that guy was the stingiest. In one of them that I watched, one guy ran out of cheese and just didn't say a word, just walked back and got more and then started cranking it again. When you're at Olive Garden, the only limit to the amount of cheese you receive is how far you're willing to go. I think that's true of God's goodness in our lives. There are so many things that will tempt us to go aside, that will tempt us to stray. There are so many fears that will tell us to stop. But the only limit on God's goodness is how far we're willing to step into it. When we go together, when we go forward, God does wonderful and beautiful things. I think that's where our final all comes in. For those moments when going forward is fearful, for those moments when we're tempted to turn back or paddle against one another, I think he invites us to go courageously because we go with him, knowing he will be with us all the days of our lives. Verse 5, we read, "No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you." For Joshua, all the days of his life, all encompassing, every second, nobody will be able to stand against him because all of his life in its totality, every minute, moment, and breath, his God will be with him and will never leave him or forsake him. From all the days, we have the invitation to go forward courageously because we go with God. It's the simplest concept. It's something I've said quite a few times up here, but I think it's a reminder that we constantly need. When we're faced with difficulty, trouble, or trial, whatever problem that we face can never be bigger than the God that we follow who goes with us and beside us. And from that promise of his presence that God gives Joshua, now I want to read the verses that follow the passage we read. Verses 7 through 9. I've included verse 6 because I want you to see the repetition in there. I am so sorry my mic's being funny. Verse 7. "Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." Do you see the repetitions in that one? Be courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Though you will face difficulty, you will find his goodness when you keep going forward together, because where you go, he goes with you. And as the worship team comes forward and as we move into a time of response, every now and then I like to give physical and tangible reminders. So on the communion table, I've placed a couple hundred teeny tiny canoe paddles as a small reminder that God is inviting us to go together, to go forward, to go courageously. And if this is where you're at, like if you're at like a rah, go team, let's do this thing. As the worship team plays, I would encourage you, just like as if it were a communion, come forward and grab one of those canoe paddles. Use it as a bookmark in your Bible or put it on your nightstand somewhere where you're always going to see it. Something as a constant reminder of our unity and togetherness, of his goodness that we have the privilege of moving forward into, and of his promise of his presence that will be with us wherever we go. Go together, go forward, go courageously. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for who you are and for what you are doing. And in this moment, we acknowledge just how big and wonderful and powerful you are, and how miraculous it is that someone such as you would take notice of people such as us. God, we pray that your presence would dwell with us in a tangible way that helps us to overcome fear, to boldly and courageously reach out to others, to boldly and courageously move forward into your promises as we step through the midst of any trial or difficulty, trusting that we'll find your goodness on the other end. In Jesus' name, amen.